The doors groaned open, and the smell hit them first, scorched metal, oil, and something sharp, chemical, like burnt ozone. Dust drifted in the cold April air as the soldiers stepped inside. Their boots echoed in the vast hangar of Peenemünde, the secret base on Germany's northern coast. They expected to find planes, maybe a few grounded jets, the last ghosts of the Luftwaffe. Instead, they froze. In the center of the room, half buried under shattered concrete and tangled cables, stood something smooth, black, and impossible. 20 feet long, with no wings, its surface gleamed like obsidian. Its nose was rounded, its body tapered. Not a bomb, not quite an aircraft. Someone whispered, "What the hell is that?" No one answered. The lieutenant, a man from Ohio who'd spent the war fighting tanks and artillery, walked closer. He ran his glove along the curved metal, finding no seams, no rivets, just a single word stenciled in fading white. A4. They found more pieces scattered across the hangar. Fins, engine casings, fragments of guidance systems that looked like they'd come from another century. Near the back wall lay a pile of documents, half-burned, labeled Vergeltungswaffe 2. Retribution Weapon 2. He turned to his sergeant. "Get the camera. And tell the colonel, this isn't an airfield. It's something else." The flashbulb went off. The white light froze the wreckage for an instant. Then darkness swallowed it again. Somewhere outside, the Baltic wind howled across the dunes. They gathered what they could: blueprints, test logs, a handful of small glass vials filled with strange fuel residues. Every sheet of paper was numbered, coded, and signed by a name that was beginning to sound familiar in Allied reports: Dr. Wernher von Braun. By the next morning, the first telegrams reached London and Washington. The tone was confused, almost frightened. Recovered materials suggest development of large, self-propelled ballistic devices. Purpose unknown. Potential range, thousands of miles. The message ended with one line underlined twice: "We may be standing on the edge of the most terrible weapon in the world." Outside the hangar, the soldiers stood smoking in silence. One of them, a mechanic from Kansas who'd seen his share of wreckage, shook his head slowly. "Doesn't even look German," he said. "Looks like it fell from space." They laughed nervously, but no one really disagreed. That afternoon, engineers from the Allied Technical Intelligence Unit arrived. They moved through the site like surgeons, speaking in clipped tones, pointing at engines that didn't belong to any known design. In one notebook, they found altitude data, 190 kilometers. Someone did the math and went pale. "That's above the atmosphere," he muttered. "That's space." Peenemünde had been bombed the previous summer. Much of it was rubble now, but the remains told their story: bunkers for liquid fuel, massive test stands scorched by fire, rails for vertical launches. And among the ruins, they found a row of small wooden desks, each with personal items left untouched: a coffee cup, a slide rule, a page torn from a magazine showing a rocket piercing the stars. The war was ending. Berlin was falling. Yet here, in this silent corner of the Baltic, the Allies had found something that didn't belong to the war at all, something that belonged to the future. An officer from the intelligence corps stared at a blackened sign above a doorway: "Here is for Versuchsanstalt Peenemünde, Army Research Center." He exhaled slowly. So this is where it began. Inside one of the offices, they found a portrait of Hitler, its glass shattered by a blast wave. Beneath it, pinned to a corkboard, was a photograph of a rocket streaking upward, white smoke cutting across the gray sky. Written underneath, in neat German script: "To the stars, through struggle." The irony hung heavy in the air. A young lieutenant gathered his notes, glanced back at the black shape in the hangar, and said quietly, "Someone dreamed this long before the war. Maybe they didn't know what it would become." The colonel nodded. Dreams are dangerous things. That night, as the convoy rolled out of Peenemünde, the soldiers could still see the ruins in the rearview mirrors, the skeletal towers, the broken cranes, and that gleaming cylinder lying silent under the moonlight. It wasn't just another weapon factory. It was a threshold, a place where human imagination had stepped too far, too fast. The radio crackled. Headquarters wanted every scrap of evidence sent west. The Americans and the Soviets were both on the move, racing for the same secret. And somewhere between those dunes and the stars, a new war, a colder, quieter one, was already beginning to form. The narrator's voice fades to a whisper. They thought they'd found a bomb. But what they found was a question, one that would haunt the world for decades. Then, a pause. Because all of it, the hangar, the wreckage, the fear, began years earlier, with a handful of young engineers who just wanted to touch the sky. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. The wind off the Baltic smelled of salt and metal. Beyond the dunes, a cluster of wooden huts stood half buried in sand. The beginnings of a place no one had heard of yet. Peenemünde, 1937. There were no soldiers then, no guards, no barbed wire. Only a group of young men in oil-stained coats, laughing, arguing, drawing on scraps of paper under the dim light of kerosene lamps. They were dreamers, engineers, and physicists, and at their center stood a tall, sharp-eyed man with a voice that carried even in the wind. Wernher von Braun. To them, it wasn't war. It was wonder. We're not building weapons, von Braun would say, pacing in front of the blackboard, chalk in hand. We're building the future. One day, we'll reach the stars. Someone would always add, half joking, as long as the army keeps paying for it. They laughed, but they all knew the truth. Their dream was expensive, and the only ones willing to fund it were uniforms. The first rockets, the A-1 and A-2, were crude, barely more than glorified fireworks. They exploded as often as they flew. Once, an engine test went so wrong that it set fire to the observation shack. Von Braun stood amid the smoke, coughing, his face black with soot, and said simply, "Next time, higher." Failure never discouraged him. Every detonation was data. Every crater, a step closer to space. But as 1938 turned to 1939, the laughter in those huts grew quieter. Uniforms became more common. The Reich's military planners had taken notice. The scientists' funding tripled, and so did the number of officers watching their tests. Von Braun's supervisor, General Dornberger, began arriving in polished boots, his orders stamped with eagle seals. "The Führer is interested in your progress," he told them. "Germany will need long-range capabilities." The meaning was clear. The rockets were no longer toys of science. They were becoming weapons. Still, von Braun's notebooks were filled not with targets or blast radii, but with equations for orbital flight, sketches of capsules, even a drawing labeled Marschflugkörper zum Mond, cruise vehicle to the moon. He was 25 years old, and he believed he was building humanity's next great step. The irony was that he wasn't wrong, just far too early and in the wrong century. The new model, the A3, was built on a bare concrete pad at the edge of the island. It had fins made from salvaged aircraft metal and a guidance system so primitive it relied on gyroscopes scavenged from torpedo parts. The first test lasted less than 30 seconds before it spun out of control and crashed into the sea. The team stood in silence. Then, from somewhere behind the smoke, Dornberger's voice barked, "Gentlemen, the Führer does not fund failures." Von Braun turned away, expression unreadable. That night, he wrote in his diary, "I have seen the face of progress, and it wears a helmet." By 1940, the army had taken full control. Peenemünde grew. New buildings, test stands, barracks. Barbed wire went up around the perimeter. The place of dreams became a fortress. The scientists received new titles, ranks, and strict orders about secrecy. The laughter was gone, yet the work continued. Engines roared through the night, echoing across the dunes. Villagers on the mainland reported seeing orange streaks rise into the fog, followed by distant explosions that shook windows miles away. Inside the labs, von Braun still spoke of altitude, of velocity, of science, but now he did it to men who wanted only range, payload, and destruction. When someone asked whether their rockets could reach London, he hesitated only a moment. Technically, he said, yes. That was enough. Funding poured in. Hundreds of workers arrived. The dream of spaceflight had become a project of war. In June 1942, Hitler himself ordered a full briefing. Von Braun stood before the Führer in a hall lined with banners and said, "My rocket can fly faster than sound and higher than any aircraft. It could carry 1,000 kilograms across the channel." Hitler's expression changed from boredom to fascination. "Then give it to me," he said. "Build it." The program was renamed Vergeltungswaffe, the weapon of retribution. The scientists went back to Peenemünde under heavy escort. The blackboards now carried new calculations, not for orbit, but for impact. The same equations that once dreamed of reaching Mars were being used to strike at London. One of von Braun's colleagues, Walter Thiel, looked at him across the drafting table late one night and said, "Do you still think we'll reach the stars?" Von Braun didn't answer. Outside, engines howled against the cold sky. Sparks flew across the launch pads. The dream that had begun with laughter and starlight was now wrapped in uniforms and guarded by guns. And somewhere deep down, they all knew they were building something that should never exist. The narrator's voice falls quiet. When the first prototype lifted from the pad, its fire lighting up the dunes, the men of Peenemünde cheered. But none of them asked where that fire would fall when it came down. A pause, the sound of a rising hum, of wind against metal. Soon, the voice continues, they would find out. The morning was gray, wet, and utterly still. A thin mist rolled in from the Baltic as engineers took their positions along the dunes of Peenemünde. It was October 3rd, 1942, the day history would look back on as the first time humankind left Earth. Though no one there thought of it that way. To them, it was just another test. Another chance to fail. The rocket stood tall on its concrete pad, 70 feet of smooth steel and promise. Painted near its nose, in white, was the name A4. Beneath it, men in leather coats worked silently, their movements rehearsed, mechanical. They checked valves, tightened fuel lines, and murmured last calculations. The smell of alcohol fuel hung thick in the cold air. Wernher von Braun watched from the control bunker, his face pale in the flickering light of the instrument panel. Months of failure had led here. Engines that had torn themselves apart. Guidance systems that spun out of control. Each explosion had been a lesson, written in smoke and debris. But this one had to work. At 9:38, the countdown began. 10, 9, 8. Outside, frost clung to the railings. The men stepped back. 3, 2, 1. A blinding flame erupted beneath the rocket. The ground shook. The noise was like the tearing of the sky itself, deeper, angrier than any engine before it. For a second, it wavered, tilting dangerously. Then, impossibly, it straightened and began to climb. The engineers stared upward, forgetting to breathe. The rocket rose faster and faster, cutting through the mist, trailing a white pillar of smoke. At 2,000 feet, it vanished into the clouds. Inside the bunker, the telemetry needles danced. Altitude, 4 kilometers. Then 10. Then 20. The operator's hand trembled as he read the numbers aloud. She's still accelerating. At 30 kilometers, the sound faded. The world went silent. Even the wind seemed to stop. Then, faintly, from somewhere above the clouds, came a distant rumble, the echo of the A4 returning to Earth. It struck the Baltic with a flash visible for miles. The shockwave rolled across the dunes, shaking sand from the roof of the bunker. And then came the voice on the radio, impact confirmed. Flight duration, 4 minutes, 55 seconds. Maximum altitude, 190 kilometers. No one spoke. They just stared at each other, stunned. Then von Braun smiled. A small, almost disbelieving smile, and said quietly, "It worked." Outside, men were already cheering, throwing their caps into the air, their voices whipped away by the wind. They had done it. The first rocket to reach the edge of space. But in the command post miles away, the celebration was different. Reports were sent to Berlin, to the Ministry of Armaments, to the Reich Chancellery itself. When Hitler read the summary later that day, he frowned. 190 kilometers, he repeated. That's higher than any plane. How far can it fly? Dornberger answered carefully. 300 kilometers, mein Führer. Perhaps more. Hitler leaned back, expression unreadable. Then London is within reach. The decision was made in that moment. The dream of exploration had become the blueprint for vengeance. Von Braun returned to Peenemünde to a hero's welcome. The next day, he was summoned to Berlin. In the smoky light of a marble hall, generals congratulated him. One of them said, "You've changed the future of warfare." He wanted to reply, "I was trying to change the future of mankind." But he didn't. He only nodded. Soon, orders arrived. Production was to begin immediately. Peenemünde would be expanded, thousands of laborers brought in. prisoners, political captives, men dragged from across occupied Europe. The A4 would be mass-produced. In his journal that night, von Braun wrote, "Today, we touched space. Tomorrow, they will use it to destroy cities. I no longer know what we are building." Weeks later, a second launch was conducted, successful again. The rocket soared beyond the stratosphere, higher than any human creation before it. And with each success came more pressure, more secrecy, more soldiers. The fire that had once symbolized hope was now a weapon being sharpened. In the village nearby, fishermen saw the rockets rise into the clouds and vanish. They called them Geister des Himmels, ghosts of the sky. They didn't know that those ghosts would soon haunt London. One of the engineers stood by the test stand after a launch, his hands black with soot, and whispered, "We've built a star that falls back to Earth." The narrator's voice lowers, almost a whisper. When that first A4 rose above the clouds, humanity crossed a line it could never uncross. It had built a machine that could touch the edge of heaven and bring hell down with it. A pause, then the faint echo of distant thunder, or maybe a rocket's roar. 2 years later, that same sound would echo over London. It was still dark when the first rocket reached London. 6:43 a.m., September 8, 1944. The city was waking, milkmen clattering bottles, buses starting their engines, a dull drizzle over the rooftops. And then, without a sound, the sky tore open. The explosion came first. A thunderous shock that threw people from their beds, shattered windows, and lifted roofs like paper. A single orange bloom over Chiswick, silent, until the sound caught up seconds later. No warning, no sirens, no aircraft overhead, just fire and dust. A police constable was among the first on the scene. He would later write, "We looked for the plane. There was none, just a crater where the street used to be." It was the first V-2 to strike London, launched from The Hague, 200 miles away. It killed 168 people in an instant. For weeks afterward, the British press didn't know what to call it. Official statements blamed gas explosions, but witnesses whispered about something new, a weapon that arrived before you could even hear it. Across the channel, in occupied Holland, the Germans cheered. They called it Vergeltungswaffen, the weapon of retribution too. A victory of science, they said, a miracle of technology. But to those who lived under its shadow, it was terror itself. Unlike the slow, buzzing V-1 flying bombs, the doodlebugs that Londoners could at least see or hear, the V-2 was invisible. It came at supersonic speed, its warhead falling from the edge of space. By the time you heard it, it had already killed you. One survivor recalled, "The ground would shiver. Then you'd see smoke rising, and you knew that was someone's home. Or it could have been yours." That autumn, rockets rained on London and Antwerp day and night. Sometimes 2, sometimes 20 a day. They left behind not battlefields but craters in quiet neighborhoods, schools, hospitals, markets. In the underground shelters, people stopped listening for the sirens. There was no point. The enemy had found a way to erase warning itself. British scientists knew it was the A4, the rocket they had heard rumors about for years. Reports from resistance fighters spoke of strange vertical launches on the Baltic coast. But no one knew where they came from, or how to stop them. Air defenses were useless. The V-2 traveled at nearly 3,500 miles per hour. Anti-aircraft guns couldn't reach it. Radar couldn't track it. It was, quite literally, faster than sound. Prime Minister Churchill, briefed in a dim war room, said grimly, "There is no defense. We can only pray they run out of them." But Britain didn't just pray. It searched. Reconnaissance planes were sent over northern Germany, scanning the coastline for any sign of rocket sites. Spy networks in occupied Europe were told, "Find Peenemont." Meanwhile, in the streets of London, life continued, stubbornly. Fire brigades worked through the rubble. Trains ran, newspapers printed. The people learned a grim new rhythm. Silence, then thunder. A child in South London wrote in his diary, "We don't hear them. We only see the sky flash." And still the rockets fell. In October, a V-2 struck a crowded cinema in Antwerp, killing more than 500 people in seconds. Another hit Woolworth's department store in New Cross, destroying an entire block. The headlines read, "Death comes faster than sound." For the first time in history, humans were being killed by weapons launched from space. In Peenemünde, the scientists celebrated the success. Their machines had reached London flawlessly, but few of them saw the photographs, the shattered homes, the burned faces of children carried from the ruins. Von Braun himself stood in his office one night, staring at the launch reports. He was an engineer, not a soldier. Yet his creation had become the perfect soldier, silent, obedient, and merciless. He once told a colleague, "The rocket worked perfectly, except for landing on the wrong planet." It was a joke, but no one laughed. In London, the public refused to break. People swept glass from their doorsteps, patched holes with tar paper, and went on. They had survived the Blitz. They would survive this too. Still, something deeper had changed. The V-2 was not just a weapon of destruction. It was a weapon of psychology. It stripped away the illusion of safety. It turned the sky itself into an executioner. Every rumble of thunder, every door that slammed, made people flinch. The silence before the explosion was worse than the blast. For the British, the question became not if the next rocket would fall, but where. For the Allies, the question was how to stop it. And so, while the rockets kept falling, somewhere in England, maps were spread across tables. Lines were drawn, targets circled, names whispered. They would find the source. They had to, because until then, the war was no longer fought in the air or on land. It was being fought in the space between, in the silent seconds before the sky fell. The narrator's voice narrows to a single, cold line. While London burned, 600 planes rose into the night, heading for the place where the fire had been born. Night fell over the Baltic like a black curtain. August 17, 1943. 600 bombers of the Royal Air Force moved through the darkness, engines beating a steady pulse over the North Sea. Each plane carried a single word in its briefing papers, Peenemünde. The target did not exist on any map. Officially, it was an army research station. In truth, it was the birthplace of a new kind of war. In the cockpits, young men scanned the horizon through icy glass. The sea below was invisible, only the moonlit shimmer of waves breaking against the German coast. Somewhere beyond that horizon lay the facility where the V-2 rocket had been born. At 12:57 a.m., the first flares fell. White light flooded the dunes, turning the sleepy fishing village and its concrete launch pads into a ghostly daylight. Then the bombs began to fall. The first wave struck the workers' quarters. Barracks and laboratories erupted in fire. A second wave hit the airfield. The ground shuddered as high explosive charges tore through fuel depots and assembly sheds. Inside the control bunker, engineers screamed into phones. "Cut the power. Get them to the shelters." But the shelters were already full. Flames raced along the wooden roofs. Cables hissed and melted. Wernher von Braun, who had been sleeping in his quarters near the beach, ran outside barefoot. He remembered later that the sky looked like a second sunrise, red, white, and angry. Around him, men were shouting names, dragging out the wounded. The raid lasted less than 40 minutes. When it was over, more than 700 people were dead, engineers, soldiers, and civilians. The laboratories where the A-4 had been tested were piles of twisted metal. For a brief moment, the Allies believed they had killed the rocket itself. But the next morning, under a gray, smoke-soaked sky, von Braun walked through the wreckage with General Dornberger. "It's over," one officer whispered. Von Braun didn't answer. He was staring at the ruined test stand, or rather, at what had survived. The blueprints, the molds, the data. "No," he said quietly. "It's only beginning." Within days, orders came from Berlin. Production would not stop. The entire project would be moved underground. Deep in the Harz Mountains, near the town of Nordhausen, the SS had already begun carving tunnels into the rock. They called the site Mittelwerk. It would become the new home of the V-2 program, safe from bombers, hidden from spies, and built on the backs of slave labor. Trains began arriving from across occupied Europe, freight cars filled not with machinery, but with men. Prisoners from Buchenwald, political captives, anyone the Reich deemed expendable. They were forced into the tunnels with picks and shovels, digging by hand through solid stone. One survivor later said, "We worked by candlelight. The air was thick with dust and blood. The rockets were built above our heads. We could hear them being assembled while people died below. In Peenemünde, what remained of the research staff packed their instruments and left. The once glittering laboratory of German engineering became a ruin guarded by soldiers who no longer knew what they were guarding. The RAF had struck a powerful blow, but not the fatal one. Intelligence reports soon revealed that rocket launches were still being detected. Only now, no one could say from where. The Germans had vanished into the earth. For the British pilots who had flown the raid, the cost was enormous. 40 bombers lost, hundreds of airmen never returning from the sea. Some had been only 20 years old. The mission's commander, Group Captain John Searby, later said, "We thought we had ended the nightmare. We hadn't. We had only driven it underground." The German High Command called the survival of the V-2 program a triumph of resilience. But in truth, it marked a descent from science into something darker. When von Braun arrived at Mittelwerk that winter, he was met not by engineers, but by SS guards. The tunnels were cold, wet, lit by dim bulbs strung along dripping walls. The sound of hammers never stopped. The air smelled of oil, concrete, and despair. He asked one of the guards how many prisoners worked there. The man smiled. "Enough," he said. Von Braun later admitted that something inside him cracked that day. Yet he continued his work. The rockets would fly again. The Reich demanded it. In London, Allied intelligence studied photographs of the bombed Peenemünde and celebrated. They had no idea that the true heart of the program was already beating again, hundreds of feet below the surface of the Earth. As the year turned to 1944, the V-2 would re-emerge, not from the sky, but from the shadows of the mountains. And for the prisoners who dug its tunnels, there was no horizon, no sunrise, no end. Only the echo of explosions above them, and the knowledge that every rocket completed meant more death on the other side of the world. The narrator's voice lowers, a whisper swallowed by the dark. The bombs had silenced Peenemünde, but the rocket lived on, beneath the ground, in the cold, beating heart of hell. The tunnels of Mittelwerk were alive with noise, metal striking stone, chains dragging across the floor, the dull thunder of generators somewhere in the dark. The air was thick with the smell of oil and bodies. A man could not tell day from night down there. Only the rhythm of work and death. They called it production, but it was closer to a ritual of survival. Each day, thousands of prisoners from Dora Mittelbau shuffled into the galleries carved into the Harz Mountains. Their striped uniforms hung in tatters, their faces gray from dust. They slept on wooden planks in damp caverns, woke to shouts, and began again, assembling rockets for a war they would never see. "Work faster," the guards barked. "The Führer is waiting." They built the V-2s in pieces. Steel casings rolled in from one tunnel, engines from another. The sections were lowered onto makeshift scaffolds where skeletal hands bolted them together. The prisoners gave the rockets nicknames: ghosts, serpents, the blackbirds. When one fell from its rigging, it crushed whoever stood below. The guards didn't stop the line. They dragged the bodies aside with hooks. A survivor later wrote, "Every rocket that left the tunnel carried a part of us with it." In total, 60,000 people passed through Dora. More than 20,000 never left. The death rate was higher than at many concentration camps, not because of executions, but because of exhaustion, starvation, and disease. Up above, the war was turning. The Allies had landed in Normandy. The Red Army was closing in from the east. The Reich was collapsing. And yet, in those tunnels, the production continued, faster, harder, as if the rockets themselves were feeding on the dying empire. Von Braun walked through the tunnels once, escorted by SS officers. He saw men too weak to stand, assembling machines that would reach the edge of space. He said quietly, "This is not engineering. This is tragedy." But he kept walking. The guards watched him, their hands on their pistols. To the prisoners, he was a ghost himself, the man in the clean coat who never spoke to them directly, who disappeared into the light at the end of the tunnel while they stayed in darkness. The V-2 was no longer a triumph of science. It was a monument built on bones. Each rocket took 10,000 man-hours to assemble. It carried a 1-ton warhead and cost more lives to build than it could ever take when it fell. But the propaganda machine called it Wunderwaffe, the miracle weapon. Newspapers in Berlin printed headlines: "The vengeance of Germany strikes again." The reality was less glorious. Of the 3,000 rockets launched, Many failed mid-flight or veered off course. Still, the terror they caused was immeasurable. Londoners heard the explosions and knew another 1,000 had died beneath the mountains to make it happen. One British intelligence report estimated that each rocket killed, on average, 3 civilians, but cost a dozen slave laborers their lives. The rockets are eating their own makers, it read. Inside Middlework, the SS kept records meticulously. Lists of parts, of production quotas, of deaths. Even as the walls trembled from distant bombing raids, the paperwork continued. The bureaucratic rhythm of genocide. By early 1945, the tunnels stretched over 2 miles underground. The prisoners said the mountain was hollow, that it was swallowing them alive. When the Allies advanced into Germany, orders came to evacuate the site. The guards began executing anyone too weak to move. Trains carried the rest south, death marches disguised as transfers. Von Braun knew the end was near. He tried to move his team toward the American lines, fearing Soviet capture. But the question followed him wherever he went. Could genius ever wash itself clean of complicity? In April, when American soldiers finally entered the tunnels, they found hundreds of bodies still inside, some hanging from the rafters, others simply collapsed where they had fallen. The air stank of rot and fuel. And in the center of it all stood a row of unfinished rockets, silent and perfect. AUS, Sargent wrote in his diary. It was like walking into hell built by engineers. Photographs taken that day show the contrast with painful clarity, sleek, black rockets gleaming under arc lamps, and beside them, the remains of the people who built them. The same week, the last operational V-2s were launched, desperate, almost symbolic. They struck London, Antwerp, and Liège. The explosions still killed civilians, but by then, the world already knew the war was ending. For the Reich, it was too late. For the victims of Dora, it had always been too late. When the Americans shut down Middlework, they sealed the tunnels with explosives. The echoes lasted for minutes. Dust rose from the ground like breath from a dying giant. A British correspondent watching from outside wrote, "They buried the rockets where they were born, under the same mountain that devoured the people who made them." But the story of the V-2 wasn't over. Some of those who built it would soon be working for a new master, one with stars on his flag instead of eagles. The narrator's voice drops, cold and steady. The war had ended for Germany. But for the rocket, for the dream born in fire and fed with blood, it was only changing sides. The air inside Hangar Number 2 was heavy with dust and silence. Outside, the summer of 1945 baked the ruins of Germany under a pale sun. Inside, the future lay in pieces. A long, sleek body of black metal stretched across the hangar floor. Around it, tables piled high with papers, engine parts, and fragments of shattered guidance systems. American soldiers in worn uniforms moved carefully between the wreckage, their boots crunching over bits of glass and wire. On a workbench near the center lay a folded blueprint marked with 2 letters, A4, the same name they had found on dozens of crates at Middlework and Peenemond. Captain Robert Staver, an Army intelligence officer, stared at the drawing for a long moment before saying quietly, "We just found the future of war." He wasn't exaggerating. The engineers who followed him, young men from Aberdeen Proving Ground and the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, could hardly believe what they were looking at. The V-2 was not just a missile. It was a glimpse of something years ahead of anything the Allies had built. Its engine burned a mixture of liquid oxygen and ethanol, driving a turbine pump at 5,000 revolutions per second. Its gyroscopic guidance system could correct its course mid-flight. Its warhead had traveled 190 miles, reaching the edge of space before plunging to Earth faster than sound. It was, as one scientist muttered, a machine that touches the stars and kills men in silence. The American officers cataloged everything, every bolt, every fragment, every document. They traced the layout of the fuel lines, the chambers, the aerodynamic fins. Some stood in awe. Others looked disturbed. "This thing was built underground," one of them said, "by prisoners, thousands of them." Another replied, "Doesn't change what it can do." In the corner of the hangar, crates were being loaded onto trucks, each one marked, "Top Secret, Shipment to U.S." The decision had already been made in the corridors of Allied command. These weapons would not be destroyed. They would be studied. At first, the debate was fierce. Some officers argued the rockets should be dismantled and erased, too dangerous, too connected to atrocity. But the scientists had other ideas. Dr. Holger Toftoy, an Army technical officer, summarized it in one cold line. If we don't take them, the Soviets will. So the collection began, thousands of pages of blueprints, diagrams, and notebooks. Test stands from Piedmont, engine parts from Mittelwerk. Even the surviving German engineers themselves, found hiding in barns or moving under false names. The Americans called it exploitation. The Germans called it salvation. In an interrogation report from June 1945, Wernher von Braun told his captors, "We wanted to go to the moon. We never wanted to build weapons." His hands trembled as he signed the statement. The interrogator wrote in the margin, "Subject intelligent, evasive. Requests to speak to U.S. scientists." Within weeks, teams of Allied experts were working in captured labs, reconstructing entire V2s from spare parts. They fired engine sections on open fields, watched the fire bloom, and marveled at the precision of German metallurgy. One American colonel remarked, "We've been fighting men who lived 20 years in the future." Across the channel, British scientists conducted their own dissections at Farnborough, laying out each section of a captured rocket like a cadaver on a table. "It's not a machine," one of them whispered. "It's a prophecy." But behind the admiration ran something darker. The realization that this prophecy had killed thousands. Every design flaw corrected, every aerodynamic innovation perfected, had cost lives in those tunnels under the Harz Mountains. Still, the logic of power was stronger than the memory of suffering. The Allies had seen the atom bomb fall on Japan. Now they were holding the next key, the power to deliver destruction from the edge of space. Reports from Washington used a new phrase, potential strategic ballistic system. It sounded clinical, but everyone in the room knew what it meant, the beginning of a new kind of arms race. At a debriefing in Paris, one British intelligence officer put it bluntly, "The war is over, but what we're holding could start another." By late summer, the Allies had removed nearly every V2 component from Germany. Whole convoys of trucks rolled west toward Antwerp, loaded with rocket parts, instruments, and crates of documents. Among them, carefully guarded, was a list of names, the scientists, engineers, and technicians who had built the weapon. The list would decide who lived, who disappeared, and who would work under a new flag. In Washington, a memorandum landed on the desk of General Eisenhower's scientific advisor. It read, "Recommendation, transfer all available personnel and material to U.S. custody immediately. Future value, incalculable." A single sentence followed, handwritten in the margin, "Bring the men who built it. We'll decide later what to call them." That line became the spark for a new operation, one that had nothing to do with victory or justice. It was about control. The officers packing up the hangar didn't yet know the name of that mission. They only knew their orders. Collect everything. Move fast. Tell no one. Outside, the trucks started their engines. Inside, the black body of the dismantled rocket gleamed under the hangar lights. Its surface still scorched, its purpose still uncertain. As the last officer closed the crate, he looked once more at the pieces of the V2, the twisted metal and the pages of equations. "This," he said quietly, "isn't the end of the war. It's the autopsy of the future." They arrived at night. No flags, no insignia, only the hum of trucks rolling through the rain. Inside sat men who had once built the weapons that burned London. Now their papers bore no names, only numbers and a single word stamped in red, overcast. Wernher von Braun sat among them, his arm still in a sling from an accident months earlier. Around him, the engineers of Piedmont whispered in low German. No one knew exactly where they were being taken, only that the Americans had promised safety and work. Operation Overcast had no ceremony. It was not rescue and not arrest. It was a harvest. The Allies were gathering not just machines, but minds, the architects of the V2. To Washington, these men were both trophies and tools. At an airstrip in Le Havre, a C-54 transport waited with engines running. An officer collected the men's papers, their ranks, their Nazi party cards, their histories, and locked them in a briefcase. From now on, they existed only as assets. Across the ocean, the U.S. Army had already chosen where to send them: Fort Bliss, Texas. A dry, endless desert on the edge of nowhere. "You'll have everything you need," Colonel Holger Toftoy told them, except the option to leave. When they landed in New York, the sky was gray. No photographers, no headlines. The men were loaded onto unmarked buses and driven south. By the time they reached the desert, the sun was blinding, the air shimmering with heat. There, behind a wire fence, the Germans began again. Their mission: rebuild the V-2 from memory. Every bolt, every valve, every equation. Reconstructed without the factories of the Reich or the ghosts that had once built them. The Americans watched closely. Some treated the scientists as colleagues, others as war criminals on probation. In the mess hall, conversations stopped when they entered. One American mechanic muttered, "Those men killed my brother." His officer replied, "Maybe they'll stop the next war." Von Braun kept to himself. He spoke softly, often about the moon, about orbit, about the future that could rise from the ashes. "The rocket doesn't care who it serves," he told a young lieutenant. "It only obeys physics." At night, he wrote in his notebook, "The same rocket, a new flag. The dream survives." The desert became their laboratory. They scavenged parts from scrap yards, built test stands out of concrete and wood, painted the familiar black and white pattern onto the V-2's curved shell. Under the scorching sun, it no longer looked like a weapon, more like a relic of another world. Meanwhile, in Washington, Overcast was renamed Operation Paperclip. New files replaced the old ones, clipped neatly over pages that mentioned the SS or forced labor. A scientist's past could vanish with the turn of a paperclip. The reasoning was simple: knowledge was power, and power was shifting. Reports from Europe said the Soviets were already rounding up their own engineers, shipping them east to Moscow. The race for the sky had begun before the peace had even settled. At Fort Bliss, tensions simmered. The Germans worked long hours, often in silence, while American soldiers stood guard outside. In briefings, von Braun talked about trajectories and guidance systems, but the officers heard something else: the promise of rockets that could cross oceans. One evening, an American engineer watched the team assemble the test rocket and whispered, "It's strange. You look at it, and you can't tell if it's the future of exploration or the end of civilization." Von Braun didn't answer. He simply stared at the horizon, where the mountains met the heat haze, and said, "Maybe it's both." Finally, in the spring of 1946, the rocket was ready. Painted, fueled, and towering against the desert sky. The soldiers cleared the range. The Germans checked the valves one last time. The countdown began. 3, 2, 1 ignition. Flames burst from the base, and the desert trembled. The V-2 lifted, roaring upward, a streak of fire against the pale blue. The men below, Germans and Americans alike, watched in silence as it vanished into the clouds. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then an American officer murmured, "She flies again." And somewhere, across a very different horizon, another country was watching and preparing its own answer. April 24, 1946. Dawn over the New Mexico desert. The mountains stood like ghosts against the horizon, their shadows stretching over the endless white sand. On the launch pad, a slender black and white rocket waited, its metal skin glittering in the sun. Around it, silence, broken only by the crackle of radios and the low hum of generators. This was not Germany. This was White Sands Proving Ground. And the rocket that stood there was not a weapon anymore. At least, that was what they told themselves. In the control bunker, a dozen men watched through small glass windows: American officers, engineers, and, standing a little apart, the team from Piedmont. Wernher von Braun adjusted his headset, his eyes fixed on the tall figure outside. Someone behind him whispered, "Hard to believe that thing once rained fire on London." Von Braun didn't reply. "It's the same machine," he finally said, "but maybe a different purpose." The countdown began. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The desert floor shook. A roar like thunder tore through the air, echoing off the distant cliffs. The rocket rose, trailing a tail of white flame that burned brighter than the morning sun. Dust and sand whipped against the observation windows. At 18 miles up, the V-2 arced gracefully and vanished into the blue. A minute later, a voice came through the speaker. Telemetry stable. Altitude confirmed. She's flying. Cheers broke out. Not loud, but relieved, almost reverent. For the first time since the war, the machine that once symbolized terror had crossed the sky under another flag. Over the next 6 years, they would do it again and again. 67 launches. Some failed, some soared. Each flight carried instruments instead of explosives, thermometers, cameras, barometers. The Americans were learning what no one had ever measured: the temperature of the upper atmosphere, the density of cosmic rays, the curvature of Earth's edge. From those flights came the data that would build new rockets: the Redstone, the Jupiter, and beyond them, a dream too large for any army, space itself. But not everyone saw progress. Some called it theft, others called it compromise. In Washington, a senator demanded, "Are we teaching the world's killers to reach the heavens?" The military answered with numbers: speed, range, potential. Morality wasn't part of the calculation. In Moscow, Stalin's engineers were already at work, assembling their own V-2 copies under a man named Sergei Korolev. The Cold War hadn't yet been named, but its first shot had already been fired, upward. At White Sands, von Braun often stayed late after each launch. He would walk alone across the cooling sand, the air still trembling with the echo of engines. Sometimes he stopped and looked at the crater where the rocket had come down, blackened and smoking. One night, an American officer joined him and asked quietly, "Do you ever think about what these things used to do?" Von Braun nodded. "Every day," he said. Then, after a pause, "That's why we have to give them a new reason to fly." By 1950, his team was moved to Huntsville, Alabama, to begin work on what would become the U.S. Army's next generation of missiles, rockets designed to reach farther, faster, higher. The V-2's shadow stretched with them. Yet, buried beneath the politics and fear, the old dream still lived: to leave Earth, not destroy it. When reporters finally asked von Braun what he had wanted all along, he answered simply, to go to the stars. He never mentioned the tunnels of Middlework. He never mentioned the prisoners who had built the first rockets by hand. History moved forward, and the shadows stayed behind. In the archives at White Sands, a single black and white photograph remains: the first V-2 lifting into the sky, its flame frozen mid-roar. No faces are visible, only the small dark figures of men watching from the sand. The caption reads, "Launch number 1, April 24, 1946. White Sands, New Mexico." Nothing else. No mention of Germany. No mention of the war. But everyone who was there that morning remembered the feeling that somewhere between the silence and the sound, humanity had stepped across a threshold it could never return from. The rocket rose, vanished into the thin blue air, and for a heartbeat the desert seemed to hold its breath. Then, far above the earth, a small black shape drifted against the light. For a moment, it looked almost peaceful, like a promise or a warning. Because the V-2 did not end in fire. It became a shadow across the future, stretching from Berlin to Cape Canaveral, from the ruins of war to the surface of the moon. And it all began with a single door opening in a ruined hangar, and a soldier whispering, "What the hell is that?"